He grabbed her in the middle of a city street, convinced he was controlling an ordinary woman. Cameras, police, and a frozen crowd waited for the usual outcome, where fear decides everything. But he didn't know one crucial thing: who she really was, and what years of training had taught her. This documentary-style story is about a fatal miscalculation and the moment confidence turns into a trap. The plan had been simple, and that was precisely why it failed. He had chosen the pawn shop because it looked like all the others he had studied before. Narrow storefront, thick glass dulled by years of fingerprints, faded signs promising quick cash for gold and electronics. Places like that lived on routine. Clerks learned to recognize regulars. Cameras grew old and predictable, and the idea of real danger faded into habit. He had convinced himself that speed would be enough, that confidence would do the rest. He would walk in, control the room, take what fit in his pockets, and be gone before anyone had time to think. What he had not planned for was hesitation. It came in small, almost invisible moments. A clerk who did not panic quickly enough. A customer who lingered near the door instead of leaving when instinct should have pushed him away. A second too long at the counter, another second spent adjusting his grip, another breath taken while he waited for compliance that did not come as cleanly as it should have. The world did not stop for him. It never did. It only slowed, just enough to let mistakes gather. The alarm was not loud at first. It was a muted sound, buried under the hum of traffic outside and the dull ringing in his own ears. By the time it fully registered, he already knew what it meant. Someone had pressed something. Someone had decided that this moment was worth the risk. He felt the shift instantly, like a pressure change in the air. The room was no longer under his control. He left with less than he expected. A handful of items shoved into his jacket, nothing worth the trouble, nothing worth the weight now dragging at his movements. The door opened, the street rushed in, and the sound followed him. Sirens, distant at first, then closer, multiplying, overlapping until direction no longer mattered. The city was waking up to him. He moved quickly without running, forcing himself to blend into the flow of pedestrians. Running drew eyes. Running told a story. He turned corners without looking back, counted steps instead of time, tried to measure distance the way he always did when things went wrong. Every intersection became a decision point. Every reflection in a window threatened to show him something he did not want to see. The first police car passed 2 blocks away. He caught the flash of color in a storefront mirror, the red and blue slicing across his peripheral vision. He lowered his head, adjusted his jacket, slowed his pace. He told himself he still had options. He always did. But the city did not care about his confidence. The second siren came closer. The third cut across his path entirely, forcing him to stop at a crosswalk with everyone else. He stood there, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, his body tense in a way that felt louder than any sound. He imagined his face already printed in someone's mind, imagined a hand lifting a phone, a voice saying something casual like, "I think that's him." Paranoia crept in, not as panic, but as calculation. He weighed the odds of recognition against the cost of movement. He discarded what he could. A small item slipped from his pocket into a trash bin as he passed, hidden by the natural chaos of the sidewalk. Another was shoved deeper, not worth losing yet, not worth carrying either. He needed to look normal. He needed to be forgettable. The streets widened as he moved farther from the pawn shop, opening into a busier area where traffic thickened and storefronts multiplied. Cafes, convenience stores, gyms, places where people came and went without purpose beyond habit. The sound of sirens echoed between buildings now, no longer distant, no longer abstract. He knew what that meant. They were closing the area. Not a full lockdown, not yet, but enough to funnel movement, enough to reduce choices. He stopped thinking in terms of escape routes and started thinking in terms of leverage. Running was no longer the solution. Speed had failed him once already. He needed something that would force the world to slow down again, something that would make everyone else cautious instead of him. He had seen it work before, on screens and in headlines. He understood the rules, even if he did not respect them. Police hesitated when civilians were involved. Crowds froze when danger became personal. Cameras changed behavior. People acted differently when they knew they were being watched. He needed a shield. The idea did not come with drama. It settled into his thoughts quietly, the way bad decisions often did, disguised as logic. He did not see it as cruelty. He saw it as necessity. Survival stripped morality down to function, and function demanded advantage. The street ahead opened into a broad urban stretch, a place where traffic slowed and pedestrians gathered at corners, waiting for signals, staring at their phones, lost in small private worlds. This was where people felt safe enough to stop paying attention. This was where the police would have to think twice before acting. He slowed his pace and let his breathing even out. His eyes moved, scanning not faces but patterns. Groups were bad. Children were bad. Anyone with companions was bad. He needed someone alone, someone who would not attract immediate interference, someone whose absence of protection would work in his favor. He noticed her without meaning to. She walked with purpose, not hurried, not distracted, her posture straight in a way that spoke of habit rather than effort. Athletic clothes, clean but worn, the kind that suggested routine rather than display. No bag, no phone in her hands, no one beside her. She did not look afraid of the city, and that made her invisible in a way fear never could. In his mind, the equation formed quickly. Alone, young, fit but not imposing. Someone who would value self-preservation over resistance, who would freeze when confronted, who would comply because compliance was safer than defiance. Someone who would not scream, not immediately, not in a way that would ruin everything. Someone who would understand consequences. He told himself he was choosing carefully, not cruelly. He drifted closer, matching her pace from a distance, adjusting his position until the angle felt right. He did not look at her face. Faces complicated things. He focused on spacing, on timing, on the gap between steps. He measured the distance to the nearest intersection, the line of sight from the nearest parked vehicles, the flow of pedestrians around them. He imagined the moment unfolding, rehearsed it in fragments rather than detail. The sirens were closer now, unmistakable, threading through the city noise like a warning meant specifically for him. Somewhere behind him, officers were narrowing their search, turning probability into intent. He felt the pressure rise again, the countdown accelerating. He made his decision. There was no dramatic pause, no last chance to turn away. One step forward, one arm lifting, his body aligning behind hers as if they had always been moving together. The contact was sudden, efficient, practiced enough to look convincing. His grip closed where he believed control lived, and the edge of threat followed close behind. The street reacted instantly. Movement stalled. Sound shifted. The world contracted around the shape they formed together. He felt it then, the sensation he had been chasing since the plan began to unravel. Control, or something close enough to pass for it. What he did not feel was resistance. Not yet. And that, more than the sirens, more than the crowd beginning to gather, should have warned him that his calculations were already flawed. For a breathless moment after his arm locked around her, the city did what he had wanted it to do. It hesitated. The stream of pedestrians thinned as if an invisible hand had pinched the street shut. Those closest to them stopped first, their bodies turning half away, half toward the danger, uncertain whether to flee or stare. A car rolled forward and then braked too late, the driver craning his neck with the slow, fascinated caution of someone who believed catastrophe belonged to other people. The sound of traffic continued, but it felt muffled now, like it had been pushed behind a wall. Even the sirens that had been hunting him seemed to shift into something else. No longer just a warning, but a pressure that tightened around his ribs. He adjusted his stance and pulled her closer, not out of emotion, but out of instinct. He wanted her body to cover him, to turn him into a problem the police could not solve quickly. That was the whole purpose, and he reminded himself of it as his pulse hammered against his throat. He could feel the heat of her skin through the thin barrier of fabric, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He expected trembling. He expected the sudden, frantic struggle that would force him to clamp down harder, to reassert dominance with pain and panic. He had built his confidence on that expectation. Instead, he felt stillness. It was not a limp surrender, not the dead weight of someone who had shut down. It was a controlled absence of movement, the kind that came from choice rather than shock. Her breathing did not race. Her shoulders did not jerk. The muscles beneath his forearm remained taut without convulsing, as if her body had already accepted the position and begun to measure it. He told himself that meant she understood. He told himself she was afraid in the right way, the useful way, frozen, compliant, waiting for instruction. He had seen it before. People who obeyed because they could imagine consequences. People whose fear was not loud, but rational. That kind of fear made them predictable, and predictable was the only thing he needed from her. His eyes moved over the street while he kept his grip. He refused to let his gaze linger on faces. Faces created stories, and stories created guilt. He looked instead at angles and exits, at the gaps between parked cars, at the open mouth of a side street 2 buildings down. He watched how quickly people were gathering, how bodies appeared as if drawn by gravity. One person lifted a phone, then another. A small circle formed around them at a cautious distance, an audience emerging in real time. This was what he wanted. He needed witnesses. Witnesses were leverage. With cameras pointed in his direction, the police would become careful. They would not want headlines. They would not want blood on a sidewalk when the world could replay it 1,000 times. It was the one kind of power he understood, the power of spectacle. He tightened his hold just enough to remind everyone that he could. He did not have to hurt her to threaten her. He only had to prove he was willing. The object in his hand, cold, sharp, simple, made that willingness visible. He angled it so that it caught the sunlight. A brief flash, like a signal. Not to her, but to the people watching. Let them see. Let them tell the police what they saw. Let them describe the blade, and the distance, and the way her throat moved when she swallowed. He felt her swallow once, small and controlled. He took that as confirmation. The sirens grew louder and then fractured, as if multiple vehicles were arriving from different directions. He heard the deeper tone of one car and the higher, urgent wail of another. The sound bounced off the buildings and returned to him in overlapping waves. His stomach clenched. He did not want them too close yet. He wanted time. Time was what he had lost inside the pawn shop, and now he needed to steal it back from the city itself. He shifted his weight, setting his feet the way he had seen men do in videos, wide enough to be stable, one leg slightly behind, the kind of stance that looked ready. It was less natural than he wanted it to be. His shoes scraped slightly on the pavement. He felt the hard edge of the curb behind his heel, the unevenness of the street, the subtle slope of asphalt. He ignored the discomfort and focused on what mattered. The police would see a man who looked planted, a man who looked in control, a man who could not be rushed. In his mind, the logic stayed clear. He had chosen her because she looked like a good bet. He had noticed the athletic clothes first. People dressed like that were everywhere in the city, but something about her made his attention catch. She moved with purpose, and purpose often meant routine. Routine meant predictability. She looked like someone coming from a gym or heading to one, someone who had structured her life around small goals. Fitness, health, discipline. People like that feared disruption. They feared injury. They feared the kind of chaos that could derail a carefully arranged existence. He assumed she would protect that existence with obedience. He also assumed that the way she looked fit but not large, strong but not threatening, meant she had never been forced into something like this before. He assumed that strength was only something people used when it was invited, in safe spaces with rules. He assumed that outside those spaces, strength folded into fear like everything else. His assumptions made him feel calm. The truth was that he had been choosing targets all his life, even before he ever picked up a weapon. He had chosen which streets to walk down, which faces to avoid, which people to push past in a crowd. He had learned to look for weakness because weakness meant advantage. He thought he could see it the way some men could smell it. A bowed head, a hurried step, a posture that shrank. He had been wrong often enough, but never in a way that mattered. Not until now. He did not know who she was, and he did not know that the calm he felt under his arm was not helplessness, but assessment. The crowd continued to form. It was not a single mass at first, but a patchwork of individuals. A man in work clothes who paused mid-step, a woman with a stroller who turned sharply away and hurried out of sight, a pair of teenagers who lifted their phones with the casual excitement of people who believed danger was entertainment. Someone across the street leaned against a wall, staring too intently, as if trying to understand the scene by force of concentration. A car horn sounded once, impatient and confused, and then fell silent. The police arrived in a burst of motion that felt both sudden and inevitable. A patrol car slid to a stop at an angle farther down the street, blocking part of the roadway. Lights flashed, painting the faces of bystanders in brief pulses of color. Another vehicle stopped on the opposite side, creating a corridor of controlled space. Doors opened. Uniforms moved quickly into positions that made sense to trained eyes. They did not rush directly toward him. They spread out, using the width of the street, the corners of parked cars, the thick pillars of a nearby building. They were building a geometry around him. He watched them carefully, feeling his earlier confidence tighten into something sharper. These were not the slow, confused officers he had imagined when he thought about hostage situations. They were controlled. Their hands moved with practiced precision. They were not panicking. They were adapting. That worried him more than panic ever could. He pulled her closer again, his arm hard against her collarbone. He wanted her to feel that he could tighten and crush if he chose. He wanted the police to feel it too. He needed their caution, their reluctance. He needed them to be more afraid of his next move than of his escape. He could sense the shift in the air as the officers assessed. They would be seeing details, the angle of his wrist, the position of the blade, the way her body stood between him and them. They would be calculating distances. They would be listening for changes in breathing, for any sign of sudden movement. He imagined them imagining him. He tried to look like the kind of man who would do the worst thing if cornered. His heart continued to race anyway. He did not understand that his need to appear dangerous was already costing him precision. His grip was strong, but it was not perfect. The more he focused on the crowd, on the police, on the cameras, the more his arms shifted. His forearm pressed slightly higher than it should have. His wrist tightened in the wrong place. He kept the blade visible, and visibility required a certain looseness, a fraction of space that allowed the light to catch. He created that space without realizing it. Under his arm, she did not thrash. She did not try to pry his hand away with frantic fingers. She did not cry out. She did not do the things he expected because she was not acting from instinct alone. She was waiting but not in surrender, waiting in calculation. Her stillness had its own rhythm. It was the stillness of someone who understood that the first movement would be the most dangerous, that the first mistake would be the last. Her breathing was controlled, not because she was not afraid, but because panic would waste oxygen and make her body betray her. She allowed her weight to settle in a way that did not fight his hold directly. She gave him exactly what he wanted to feel, compliance. But while she gave him that illusion, she gathered information. She noted the pressure of his forearm and where it sat across her upper chest. It was firm, but not perfectly placed. It sat slightly too high, closer to her throat than her sternum, which meant his leverage was less secure than he believed. She felt the tension in his hand and the minute tremor in his fingers as his attention snapped between police and crowd. She sensed where his weight rested, slightly back on his rear foot, as if he was bracing for a rush that never came. She felt the angle of the blade and the way it moved when he breathed. She felt the small scrape of his shoe as he adjusted. To him, she was a shield. To her, he was a set of mechanics. The police held their positions, and the crowd quieted in a way that felt unnatural. The kind of quiet that came when people were holding their breath, hoping not to be the one who triggered the next moment. Phones remained raised. The scene was becoming a recording, a thing that would live beyond the street. He saw an officer shift behind a car door, and his body reacted. His shoulders tightened, his elbow drew in a fraction. His eyes flicked toward the movement, and for an instant his focus left the woman under his arm. It was a small lapse, nothing he would have noticed in a normal day. But she noticed it. She did not move yet. She did not need to. The lapse told her what she needed to know. He was not able to hold his attention on two things at once. He was trying, but the strain of it was visible in his body. He was the kind of man who relied on fear to do his work for him. He did not have the training that taught a person to maintain calm under competing stimuli. Every new sound, every shifting shadow, every step of an officer forced his nervous system to react. He could be baited into distraction simply by the environment doing what it always did. That was important. It meant time was on her side, not his. He believed he was buying minutes, forcing the police into hesitation. He did not realize that with every minute he held her, his muscles would tire and his control would degrade. He would grip too hard and waste strength, then loosen slightly to adjust, then overcorrect. The body could not sustain maximum tension forever. It would either fail or adapt into a weaker, more economical hold. Either way, the perfect moment would appear. The city helped create that moment without trying. A car rolled slowly past and then stopped again, trapped by the blockade. The engine idled too loudly, a low rumble that filled the pause. Someone in the crowd shifted, their shoe scraping the pavement, and the sound seemed amplified in the tense air. A distant siren wailed and then faded, replaced by another from a different direction. The sunlight struck the pavement and reflected up, bright enough to make him squint. He blinked more than once, irritation creeping into his expression. He thought these were distractions for the police. They were distractions for him. His mind clung to a certain story, that he was clever, that he had turned a failed robbery into a controlled negotiation, that he had outsmarted a system designed to catch men like him. He needed that story to keep his fear from swallowing him. He needed to believe he was dominant, because if he admitted he was trapped, panic would take over, and panic would make him sloppy. The irony was that the effort to maintain the story was making him sloppy anyway. He tightened his arm again and pulled her back, shifting her slightly so that he stood more squarely toward the police. He wanted a clear line of sight to the officers' faces. He wanted to see their hesitation. He wanted the satisfaction of watching them hold back. The movement was not smooth. He rebalanced with an awkward step, his rear foot sliding a fraction on the asphalt. His grip shifted higher. The blade wavered for a second as his wrist compensated. He recovered quickly, but recovery did not erase the fact that he had revealed something. His stance was not as stable as he believed. She absorbed the information like a calm tide. She also absorbed something else, something that had nothing to do with technique. She registered the presence of the crowd in the phones, the way this moment was being transformed into spectacle. That mattered because it affected the police. It affected him. It would affect what happened next. She understood that if she waited too long, he might be forced into desperation, and desperation could be dangerous. She also understood that if she moved too soon, the police might react unpredictably, and unpredictability could be fatal. There was a narrow path between those outcomes, and walking it required patience. So she remained still. To him, her stillness continued to look like surrender. He mistook her control for compliance, her patience for fear. He did not see that she was not waiting for permission. She was waiting for physics. The officers remained behind their improvised cover, weapons not raised dramatically but ready, their bodies angled to reduce their own exposure. They were cautious, but caution did not mean weakness. They were building their own calculations, exchanging quick glances, repositioning by inches. They were trying to widen the margins of safety. They were trying to reduce the variables created by the crowd. And the crowd, despite its fear, continued to film. A living wall of witnesses. He felt the cameras and liked it. He imagined, absurdly, that he could win a kind of fame from this, that his name would mean something, that he would be remembered as the man who stood up to the police and forced them to negotiate. He clung to that fantasy because it made his fear feel like adrenaline. The sun kept beating down. Sweat began to gather under his collar. His arm stayed locked, but the muscles in his forearm burned with the effort of maintaining pressure. His fingers tightened around the handle of the knife until the grip felt slick. He adjusted again, imperceptibly, to relieve strain. He told himself the adjustment was tactical. It was not. It was fatigue announcing itself. She felt it too. The slightest change in pressure, the tiny repositioning of his wrist. It was not much, but she did not need much. She had spent years learning that the difference between control and loss could be a single inch, a single shift of weight. She did not think in terms of dramatic victory. She thought in terms of openings. Openings were always small. Openings always felt like nothing right up until they became everything. He believed he had chosen an easy target because she looked like a woman who valued safety. He did not understand that he had chosen someone who valued discipline more. The sirens, the crowd, the officers, the bright city street, all of it pressed in. He still believed he was the center of the scene, the author of the moment. But beneath his arm, behind his assumptions, another story was quietly assembling itself, piece by piece, built from patience and breath in the slow mathematics of leverage. He wanted fear to do his work for him. Instead, fear was doing her work. And as the standoff settled into its tense, public stillness, as the city held its breath and the officers waited for a mistake, the mistake was already forming inside him, invisible to everyone but the woman he held. The first real minute after the police took their positions felt longer than all the running that had come before it. Time stretched in a way that made every sound distinct. The idle growl of a trapped car engine vibrated against the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a loose piece of metal tapped rhythmically against a pole, stirred by the faint breeze moving between buildings. Shoes scraped as people adjusted their stance, careful not to step too close, unwilling to step away. The street had transformed into a stage without warning, and everyone present had been assigned a role without consent. He tightened his arm again, not because it was necessary, but because it reassured him. The pressure reminded him that she was there, that he still held something valuable, something fragile. His grip was firm, practiced enough to feel convincing, but it lacked the precision of someone who truly understood restraint. It was the grip of a man who believed strength alone could substitute for knowledge. He angled her body so that she stood slightly ahead of him, her back pressed to his chest. From the outside, it looked deliberate, calculated. In truth, he was compensating for the way his weight had begun to drift backward, the subtle imbalance caused by the tension in his legs and the uneven surface beneath his feet. He wanted to look immovable. He wanted to feel immovable. The crowd reacted in waves. Those closest froze, eyes wide, breath shallow. Others arrived late, slowing as they realized what they were walking into, their confusion quickly replaced by curiosity. Phones rose almost instinctively, lenses glinting in the sunlight. People leaned around each other, whispering, pointing, forming a loose ring that left just enough space for fear to circulate. He noticed the phones and felt a grim satisfaction. Cameras meant accountability, and accountability meant hesitation. He had seen enough footage to know how these situations played out. Officers spoke softly. Negotiators arrived. Time dragged. Sometimes the man with the weapon walked away. Sometimes he didn't. But either way, the presence of witnesses slowed everything down. That was what he needed most. The police understood it too. They positioned themselves with care, spreading across the street instead of rushing forward. One officer crouched behind the open door of a patrol car. Another used the concrete edge of a storefront for cover. Their weapons were visible but not raised dramatically. This was not a show of force. It was a posture of control. He watched them closely, tracking every movement. His eyes darted from face to face, trying to read intention. He wanted to see fear in them. He wanted to see uncertainty. Instead, he saw focus. Their expressions were tight, disciplined, shaped by training that allowed them to manage their own fear instead of broadcasting it. That unsettled him more than panic would have. He leaned his head closer to hers, close enough to feel the heat rising from her skin. He wanted her to understand the seriousness of the situation, to feel the threat as something real and immediate. He expected her body to respond, to stiffen, to tremble, to betray fear through instinct. It didn't. Her breathing remained steady, shallow enough not to draw attention, controlled enough not to betray strain. Her shoulders stayed level, not hunched in anticipation of pain. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, fingers relaxed, neither clenched nor reaching. She did not test his grip. She did not push against it. She did not give him the satisfaction of reaction. To him, it looked like compliance. He mistook her calm for surrender and felt his confidence swell. He had chosen well. She was doing exactly what he needed her to do. Stay still, stay quiet, stay useful. He believed fear had done its work quickly and efficiently. He believed he was already winning. He did not notice how her weight had settled. She allowed herself to lean just enough to make his arm feel effective, just enough to reinforce his belief that the hold was secure. She adjusted her stance subtly, distributing her weight evenly across both feet, aligning her balance with the pavement beneath her. She felt the rough texture of asphalt through the thin soles of her shoes, the slight slope of the road, the proximity of the curb behind his heel. These details were not abstract. They were data. The police began to manage the space. An officer gestured sharply, directing a small group of onlookers farther back. Another moved laterally, changing the angle from which he observed the hold. Each shift forced him to turn his head slightly, to track the movement. Each time he did, his body responded with tiny corrections, his elbow tightening, his wrist flexing, his shoulders tensing. The effort accumulated. He could feel sweat beginning to gather along his spine, trapped beneath his jacket. His forearm burned with the constant pressure, the muscle fibers protesting the sustained contraction. He adjusted again, rolling his shoulder to relieve the strain. The movement was minimal, but it caused the blade to lift and settle again, its position changing by a fraction of an inch. She felt it. She felt the exact moment his wrist compensated, the exact angle at which the pressure shifted. She felt the imbalance in his stance grow more pronounced as he reacted to the police instead of maintaining his hold. She did not rush the realization. She let it sink in, letting her body memorize the information. The street seemed to breathe around them. The crowd murmured, then quieted again, as if responding to an unspoken signal. Someone dropped something, a bottle perhaps, and the sharp crack echoed too loudly. Several people flinched. He flinched too, his grip tightening reflexively. He told himself that was good. A tighter grip meant control, but control was not about strength alone. Control was about economy, about knowing where to apply pressure and where to relax. He was wasting energy, reacting to every stimulus as if it were a threat. His nervous system was in constant motion, his muscles never settling into efficiency. She, by contrast, conserved everything. She allowed the fear to exist without letting it govern her. She acknowledged the blade near her throat, the crowd, the police, the cameras. She did not deny the danger. She simply refused to let it dictate her timing. Fear sharpened her attention instead of dulling it. The police officers spoke to each other in brief, quiet exchanges. Their movements were deliberate, measured. They were building a perimeter not just around him, but around the situation itself. They wanted to reduce variables to slow the chaos he had created. He watched them and felt the pressure increase. He wanted them closer and farther away at the same time. Close enough to listen, far enough to hesitate. He pulled her back again, dragging her half a step toward him to reassert his presence. The movement was abrupt, unnecessary. It revealed more than he intended. His rear foot scraped against the curb, catching slightly before he corrected. The correction shifted his weight forward, compressing his stance and forcing his arm higher across her chest. She felt the scrape. She felt the shift. She felt the loss of alignment. It was not enough yet, but it was proof. The crowd's attention intensified. People leaned forward, trying to capture the moment from better angles. The pressure of being watched seeped into him, making every motion feel exaggerated, every decision heavy with consequence. He wanted to appear dominant, but dominance under observation required performance. Performance demanded energy. Energy was slipping away from him in small, unnoticed increments. He imagined himself at the center of the frame, a figure of threat and control. He imagined headlines, footage replayed endlessly. The fantasy gave him strength, but it also distracted him. He began to play to the audience, even if he did not realize it. His posture became more rigid, his gestures more pronounced. She noticed the rigidity. Rigidity meant fragility. She remained silent, her body yielding just enough to keep him confident. She did not fight the direction of his movements. She moved with them, letting his adjustments guide her instead of resisting. This did two things. It prevented him from feeling opposition, and it allowed her to feel every change in his balance as if it were her own. The police waited. They were trained to wait. They understood that rushing a man holding a blade against a civilian's throat was a gamble with terrible odds. They understood that time could work for them as well as against them. The longer he stood there, the more likely he was to tire, to make a mistake, to reveal an opening. They did not know how closely she was tracking the same truth. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off windows and metal, turning the street into a bright, exposed corridor. He squinted again, irritation flickering across his face. He shifted his head to avoid the glare, and his arm followed the motion unconsciously. The blade wavered, its position changing again. She absorbed it. A police vehicle arrived at the edge of the scene, stopping at a distance that signaled coordination rather than escalation. Doors opened quietly. More uniforms appeared, spreading the perimeter wider, reinforcing the sense that the situation was contained. He felt the containment like a tightening net. His earlier sense of control began to feel brittle, dependent on too many factors outside his command. He told himself that as long as he held her, none of that mattered. He was wrong. His grip was no longer a fixed point. It was a dynamic system constantly adjusting to stress. Each adjustment introduced error. Each error accumulated. The crowd grew quieter, the way people do when they sense something approaching. Not resolution, but change. Phones continued to record, their silent attention unwavering. The city had become a witness, and witnesses had a way of pulling the truth out of situations, whether anyone wanted them to or not. He tightened his jaw and focused on the officers directly ahead of him. He wanted to meet their eyes, to challenge them, to dare them to act. In doing so, he turned his head fully toward them for the first time. His shoulders followed, his stance narrowed by a fraction. She felt the opening begin to form. She did not move yet. She could afford to wait a little longer. Every second increased the probability that he would give her more. More imbalance, more fatigue, more distraction. He believed the situation was frozen, locked in a tense equilibrium that favored him. In reality, it was sliding slowly, inevitably, away from him. And as the standoff deepened, as the illusion of control hardened in his mind, the foundation beneath it continued to erode, quietly, patiently, until all that would be left was the moment when it finally gave way. The standoff settled into a shape that felt almost permanent, as if the street itself had decided to hold them there, until something broke. He chose to let it last. At first, the decision felt like strategy. Time, he believed, was leverage. Every second that passed without police action confirmed his assumption that they were afraid to make a mistake. Every moment the crowd remained intact, phones raised and recording, reinforced the idea that he was untouchable as long as he held his position. He convinced himself that stillness was power, that forcing everyone else to wait was the same as winning. So he stayed where he was. He adjusted his stance only when discomfort demanded it, shifting his weight from one leg to the other, rolling his shoulders to relieve the burning ache in his forearm. Each movement was small enough to seem inconsequential, but none of them were free. His body paid for every correction, every sustained contraction, every moment of heightened alertness. Muscles that were not meant to hold tension indefinitely began to protest, then fatigue, then subtly fail. He ignored the signs. Fear, he believed, was doing the work for him. Fear kept the police at a distance. Fear kept the crowd from interfering. Fear kept the woman under his arm quiet and compliant. Fear was the reason no one rushed him, no one screamed, no one tried to be a hero. Fear was his ally. What he did not understand was that fear worked differently depending on who carried it. For him, fear was loud. It spiked and receded, drove his attention outward, forced his nervous system into constant reaction. It made him hyper-aware of movement and sound, compelled him to respond to every perceived threat. Fear kept him alive, but it also exhausted him. For her, fear was contained. She did not deny it. She felt the blade near her throat, the pressure of his arm, the presence of the crowd and the police. She understood the stakes with complete clarity. But instead of letting fear dictate her actions, she folded it into focus. Fear sharpened her awareness instead of scattering it. It anchored her to the present moment, to the physical realities of balance, leverage, and timing. The longer the standoff lasted, the more those differences mattered. The police worked quietly at the edges of the scene. Officers communicated in brief, efficient motions, shifting positions by inches rather than yards. They widened the perimeter with patience, gently pushing onlookers back, redirecting foot traffic, closing off side streets. Their goal was not to rush him, but to reduce the chaos he relied on. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, fewer variables, fewer opportunities for something to go wrong. He resented their calm. He wanted visible hesitation, raised voices, signs of uncertainty. He wanted to feel that they were trapped by his presence, just as he felt trapped by theirs. When that did not happen, frustration crept in. His jaw tightened, his grip hardened unnecessarily. He pulled her closer again, pressing her back into his chest to remind himself and everyone else that he still held control. The movement was abrupt. His forearm pressed higher across her chest, his elbow flaring outward before settling back in. The blade lifted slightly, then returned to its threatening position. To the crowd, it looked dangerous. To the police, it looked volatile. To her, it looked inefficient. She felt the tension in his arms spike, then waver. She felt the way his breathing had changed, no longer steady but uneven, drawn from his upper chest instead of his diaphragm. She felt the micro-adjustments in his stance as he compensated for fatigue, the subtle shifts that betrayed how hard he was working to maintain the illusion of control. She let him believe it was working. The crowd continued to watch, caught between fear and fascination. Some people stepped back when officers gestured, others lingered at the edges, unwilling to leave the story unfolding in front of them. Phones remained raised, their lenses unblinking. The presence of those devices weighed on him more heavily with each passing minute. He was aware of how he looked, how he stood, how his actions would be interpreted later by people who were not there. He began to perform without realizing it. His posture became more rigid, his movements more deliberate. He wanted to look decisive, dangerous, worthy of caution. But performance demanded energy, and energy was a finite resource. The longer he held the pose, the more his body rebelled against it. His shoulders stiffened. His grip lost subtlety. His balance grew less forgiving. The police noticed. They saw the changes not as a single moment, but as a pattern. The slight tremor in his forearm, the way his weight favored one leg more than the other, the way his head turned sharply toward sound, leaving his periphery unguarded. They did not react openly, but they adjusted their own positions to account for what they were seeing. They prepared for possibility. He misread their stillness as weakness. He believed that by dragging the situation out, he was increasing his chances of escape. He imagined negotiations, imagined demands, imagined a vehicle pulling up at his command. He imagined walking away while the cameras rolled, his face hidden, but his presence undeniable. The fantasy steadied him even as reality undermined it. He did not notice how the street itself was working against him. The pavement was unforgiving, its slight slope forcing his calves to work harder than they would on level ground. The curb behind him limited his ability to step back freely, turning every adjustment into a careful calculation. The sunlight reflected off nearby windows, creating glare that made his eyes water and his focus slip. Sounds echoed unpredictably between buildings, magnifying small noises into sudden shocks. Each of these elements chipped away at his control. She absorbed all of it. She cataloged the environment with quiet efficiency, the texture of the asphalt beneath her feet, the distance to the nearest parked car, the way the curb angled behind his heel, the rhythm of his breathing, and how it changed when police shifted positions. She felt the tension in his arm ebb and flow, sensed when he compensated for discomfort by tightening in the wrong places. She did not fight his movements. She moved with them, allowing her body to remain aligned beneath his, keeping him confident. Resistance would have triggered escalation. Compliance bought her time. Time was everything. The police continued their methodical work. More officers arrived, stopping at a distance that signaled coordination rather than urgency. They took positions that closed off escape routes without provoking reaction. They allowed the crowd to thin naturally, discouraging spectators without creating panic. The scene grew quieter, more contained, more focused. He felt the containment and mistook it for negotiation. He believed they were giving him space out of fear. He did not understand that space was a tool, not a concession. The fewer people around him, the less cover he had. The quieter the street became, the more exposed he was. He tightened his grip again, his forearm burning now with sustained effort. Sweat dampened his clothing, making his jacket cling uncomfortably to his back. He shifted his stance to relieve pressure, rolling his weight forward, then back. The movement was subtle, but it altered the alignment of his body in a way he did not fully register. She did. She felt the moment when his center of gravity moved too far back, then too far forward. She felt the way his grip compensated by squeezing harder instead of adjusting position. She felt the inefficiency, the waste of strength, the lack of economy. These were not the habits of someone trained to restrain another person under pressure. These were the habits of someone relying on adrenaline and fear. The crowd had grown quieter now, the initial shock replaced by a tense, watchful silence. People sensed that the situation was approaching a turning point, even if they could not articulate why. Phones remained raised, but fewer people spoke. The air felt heavy, charged. A police officer shifted position behind a patrol car, the movement controlled but noticeable. Another adjusted his stance near a storefront, changing the angle of observation. These were small actions, but they drew his attention. His head turned, his shoulders followed, his stance narrowed by a fraction. He did not realize he had given something away. She felt the opening form, faint but unmistakable. It was not yet the moment, but it was proof that a moment would come. The bet he had placed on fear was beginning to fail, not because fear was absent, but because it was working against him. Fear made him tense. Tension made him inefficient. Inefficiency created mistakes. She waited. She did not rush the process. She understood that desperation could turn a bad situation catastrophic. If he felt cornered too suddenly, he might act without thought. She needed him tired, distracted, convinced that nothing was changing. She needed him to believe he was still in control right up until the instant he was not. The police waited as well. They had learned long ago that patience could be a weapon. Every second that passed without incident increased the chance that the person holding the weapon would make an error. Fatigue, frustration, and overconfidence were predictable outcomes of prolonged stress. They did not need to force those conditions. They only needed to allow them. He mistook their patience for paralysis. His breathing grew louder, less controlled. His jaw clenched. He swallowed hard, the motion visible to anyone watching closely. He shifted his grip yet again, trying to find a position that hurt less, that burned less, that felt sustainable. The blade wavered for a fraction of a second before settling back against her skin. She registered the change and filed it away. The street, once chaotic, now felt unnaturally still. The city seemed to be holding its breath. The spectacle he had relied on was fading, replaced by something more dangerous. Focus. Without the noise of panic and crowds, his mistakes stood out more clearly. Without constant movement around him, his own movement became more obvious. He had believed that stretching the moment would protect him. In reality, stretching the moment was dismantling him. As the standoff deepened, as the sun continued its slow climb, and the weight of attention bore down on him, the foundation of his control weakened further. The fear he had bet everything on no longer worked in his favor. It had turned inward, feeding his tension, draining his strength, sharpening the senses of the people waiting for him to fail. And beneath his arm, patient and precise, she felt the situation tipping, felt the balance beginning to shift, and knew that the moment he had been trying to avoid was no longer a question of if, but when. The street no longer felt like a place where time moved forward. It felt suspended, balanced on the edge of a decision that had not yet announced itself. The noise of the city had thinned to a distant hum, as if the world beyond the perimeter had agreed to carry on quietly so as not to disturb what was unfolding here. Even the sunlight seemed fixed, glaring down without shifting, exposing every movement, every breath. He remained convinced that nothing essential had changed. From his perspective, the rules were holding. The police had not rushed him. No one from the crowd had interfered. The woman beneath his arm remained compliant, her body aligned with his, her movements minimal. He read the stillness as fear settling in, the kind of fear that made people wait for instructions instead of acting on impulse. He believed that as long as she did not fight him, he had already won half the battle. He did not realize that the stillness had nothing to do with obedience. She had begun to work in a different register entirely, one where time was measured not in seconds but in signals. Her focus narrowed, not to the crowd or the police or the abstract danger of the blade, but to the concrete mechanics of the body behind her. She felt him as a system under strain, a structure built on tension rather than alignment. Every breath he took told her something. Every shift of his weight revealed where that tension pooled and where it leaked away. She did not need to think in words. Her training had long ago pushed conscious thought aside in moments like this. What remained was awareness sharpened by repetition, an internal map of balance and leverage constantly updating itself. She felt the pressure of his forearm and knew exactly how much of it was strength and how much was desperation. She felt the angle of his wrist and understood how much force he would need to apply to maintain it, how unsustainable it was over time. She let her breathing stay slow. That choice alone did more than any struggle would have. His breath, already uneven, began to mirror the rhythm of the situation rather than control it. The contrast between their bodies grew sharper with each passing moment. His muscles worked harder, burned faster. Hers remained ready, conserved, waiting. The police were doing their own calculations. They had stopped trying to reshape the scene dramatically. Instead, they refined it. Officers adjusted their positions with subtlety, stepping a few inches to one side, changing the angle of observation, closing small gaps that might have offered escape. They communicated with glances and gestures rather than words, trusting that clarity mattered more than speed. Their restraint was deliberate. Every sudden move carried the risk of provoking an irreversible reaction. They watched him closely. They saw the fatigue settling into his posture, the way his shoulders lifted with each breath, the way his stance had narrowed despite his attempts to appear solid. They saw how often his attention snapped toward sound, how his focus fractured under the weight of competing stimuli. They did not need to rush. The longer he stood there, the more predictable he became. He felt their scrutiny and bristled under it. It made him want to reassert himself, to remind everyone that he was still dangerous, still in control. He tightened his grip again, not to improve it, but to reassure himself. The pressure spiked, then settled into a less efficient hold. He rolled his shoulders slightly, trying to ease the ache spreading through his arm, and in doing so altered the alignment of his elbow. She noticed immediately. That single adjustment told her more than minutes of stillness ever could. The hold had degraded. Not enough for a careless move, not enough for a reckless gamble, but enough to confirm what she had already suspected. He was compensating rather than controlling. His body was reacting instead of dictating. She tested nothing outwardly. She did not push, did not twist, did not invite resistance. She allowed her weight to remain neutral, centered, giving him no excuse to tighten further. The goal was not to trigger pain or panic. The goal was to let physics do the work. Her awareness expanded beyond his body to the environment again, folding external factors into the calculation. She felt the texture of the pavement through her shoes, noted the subtle slope that had been forcing him to adjust repeatedly. She gauged the distance to the nearest parked vehicle, the position of the curb behind his heel. She registered the way the sunlight struck the street at an angle that forced him to squint whenever he turned his head toward the police. Every element mattered. He shifted his feet again, trying to relieve the strain in his calves. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it altered his center of gravity. He leaned back slightly, then forward, searching for a position that felt stable. Each micro-adjustment introduced another opportunity for imbalance. She felt the shift ripple through him. It was not yet the moment. She knew that with the same certainty, she knew the feel of her own breath. Acting too soon would mean fighting his strength while it still had coherence. Acting too late would risk him realizing how much control he had lost. Timing was everything, and timing depended on patience. The crowd had thinned further now, not because curiosity had faded, but because the police had gradually pushed spectators back. The people who remained stood farther away, their phones still raised, but their presence less chaotic, less noisy. The reduction of movement around him removed distractions he had unconsciously relied on. Without the constant shifting of bodies and noise, his own movement stood out more clearly against the stillness. He felt exposed. That sensation fed his anxiety, even if he did not acknowledge it consciously. He wanted something to happen. He wanted negotiation, escalation, resolution, anything that would break the monotony of waiting. Waiting made his muscles ache. Waiting made his thoughts circle back on themselves. Waiting forced him to feel his own fear instead of projecting it outward. He swallowed hard and adjusted his grip again, his fingers tightening around the handle of the blade. The movement caused his wrist to flex, changing the angle at which the metal pressed against her skin. It was not a dramatic change, but it mattered. It created a fraction of space where none had existed before. She cataloged it calmly. She did not flinch. She did not react. She let the moment pass as if it meant nothing. That was important. If he sensed awareness, he might overcorrect. She needed him to believe that his adjustments were effective, that his control remained intact. The police continued to wait. They saw the signs as clearly as she did, even if they interpreted them through a different lens. Fatigue, tension, overconfidence. These were patterns they recognized from training and experience. They knew that prolonged stress often led to a critical lapse, a moment when attention wandered or strength failed. They were ready to act when that lapse came, but they were careful not to force it. He misinterpreted their stillness yet again. To him, it confirmed that his tactic was working. Fear was keeping them in check. Fear was buying him time. Fear was the reason no one rushed him, no one fired a shot, no one attempted a risky intervention. He leaned into that belief because it made the situation bearable. He did not consider that fear could sharpen rather than paralyze. She felt her own fear settle into something steady, almost quiet. It was there, undeniable, but it no longer spiked or surged. It existed as a constant awareness, a reminder of consequences, not a command. Her focus narrowed further, excluding everything that did not directly affect the mechanics of the situation. She waited for a trigger, not a dramatic one, not a shouted command or sudden movement, but something subtle and reliable. A step taken at the wrong angle, a shift of attention, a reflexive response to an external stimulus. These moments always came under sustained stress. Always. The environment began to provide them. An officer moved behind a patrol car, repositioning to get a clearer line of sight. The movement was controlled, but it caught his attention. His head turned slightly, his shoulders followed, his stance adjusted to compensate. She felt the change ripple through his body. It was small, but it aligned with other factors. The slope of the pavement, the fatigue in his legs, the inefficient angle of his grip. The opening was not fully formed yet, but it was no longer hypothetical. It existed in the present, waiting to be expanded. She did not move. She let the moment pass, allowed him to recover his stance partially. She needed more than a possibility. She needed inevitability. The difference between the two was often only seconds, but those seconds mattered. He tightened his jaw and exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his expression. His breathing grew louder, less controlled. He rolled his shoulders again, trying to release the tension building there, and in doing so shifted his elbow outward just enough to alter the pressure of his hold. She registered it instantly. That movement, combined with the previous ones, created a pattern she recognized. He was not settling into a stable configuration. He was oscillating, constantly correcting, constantly adjusting. That kind of movement under stress always led to error. The body could not sustain it indefinitely. The street felt even quieter now, as if the city itself sensed the approach of change. The crowd held back. The police held their positions. No one spoke. No one moved abruptly. All eyes remained fixed on the two figures at the center of the scene. He believed he was still dictating the terms. In reality, the terms had already shifted. She waited not because she was unsure, but because certainty demanded restraint. When the moment came, it would need to be decisive, clean, and controlled. Anything less would invite chaos, and chaos was the one thing she could not afford. Her patience was not passive, it was active, deliberate, honed by years of understanding how quickly situations could collapse if rushed. She had learned that the safest resolution often came from letting the other person exhaust their options, their strength, their confidence. He was doing that for her. With every breath, every adjustment, every glance toward the police, he narrowed the margin between control and loss. He could not feel it happening because fear had convinced him that stillness meant safety. She knew better. She felt the balance tipping, felt the system straining beyond its limits. The opening was no longer a question of if, it was forming in real time, shaped by fatigue, distraction, and the relentless logic of physics. She remained still, her body calm, her focus absolute, waiting for the final trigger that would turn calculation into action and end the illusion he had built his survival on. The moment did not arrive with drama. There was no shout, no sudden rush, no signal that announced itself to the crowd or the police. It came the way such moments always did, quietly, buried inside an ordinary movement that had happened dozens of times before, but which this time unfolded just a fraction differently. An officer shifted behind the open door of a patrol car. It was a controlled movement, deliberate and cautious, but it altered the geometry of the scene. The reflection of sunlight flashed briefly across the car's window, drawing his attention without intention. His head turned toward the movement, not sharply but enough. His shoulders followed the turn, and his stance adjusted to compensate. It was the adjustment that betrayed him. His rear foot, already cramped by the curb and the slope of the pavement, slid a few centimeters farther than he intended. His weight shifted backward, then forward again as he tried to correct it. The correction came too late and in the wrong direction. The alignment of his body broke, just enough to create a chain reaction. She felt it immediately. The change moved through him like a ripple, starting in his feet, traveling up through his legs, his hips, his torso. The pressure of his forearm altered, no longer evenly distributed. The blade wavered, its line no longer perfectly aligned with her throat. His grip tightened reflexively, but the tightening came from tension rather than structure. That was the trigger. She did not think. She did not hesitate. The calculation had already been made. Now the body executed what the mind had prepared. Her first movement was not aggressive. It was defensive, precise, almost subtle. She shifted her weight downward and slightly forward, dropping her center of gravity in a way that immediately disrupted his balance further. At the same time, she rotated her shoulders just enough to change the angle of his forearm against her chest. The movement broke the line of pressure he relied on, without forcing a direct struggle. His grip weakened for an instant. She used that instant. Her hand came up to his wrist, not striking, not slapping, but guiding it, redirecting the blade's path away from her neck with a firm, practiced motion. The action was economical, requiring far less strength than panic would have demanded. The knife was no longer the center of the threat. His balance was. He reacted too late. By the time he felt the shift, his body was already committed to a losing position. His attempt to tighten his grip only compounded the error, drawing his arm higher and opening his side. She rotated her torso sharply into the space he had unintentionally created, using his own momentum to widen the gap. The street seemed to inhale. The crowd gasped, not all at once, but in a scattered chorus as the static image they had been watching suddenly changed shape. Phones tilted and shook as people tried to follow the movement. For a heartbeat, no one understood what they were seeing, only that something had finally broken. The police moved, not recklessly, not firing, but advancing with purpose. They had been waiting for exactly this, a clear shift in control, a visible disruption that justified intervention without escalating the danger. Their weapons remained trained but restrained, their steps measured even as they closed the distance. He stumbled. The loss of balance forced him to take an involuntary step forward, his foot striking the pavement awkwardly. His grip on the knife loosened as his body focused on not falling. He tried to reassert control, tried to pull her back into him, but the leverage was gone. The system he had built on tension collapsed under its own inefficiency. She stayed close enough to deny him space. Her movements were fast but not frantic. She remained connected to him, controlling distance and angle, preventing him from resetting his stance. Another rotation of her shoulders further compromised his grip, and with a sharp, decisive motion, she twisted his wrist at the exact point where strength turned into pain. The knife fell. It hit the pavement with a sound that seemed far louder than it should have been, a hard metallic clatter that echoed down the street. The sound cut through the moment like punctuation, unmistakable and final. He reacted with disbelief before fear. For an instant, he did not understand what had happened. His mind lagged behind his body, still clinging to the assumption that he was the one dictating the situation. That delay cost him everything. She did not give him time to recover. She shifted again, stepping into his space and using the compromised position of his arm to force him downward. The motion was controlled, efficient, rooted in leverage rather than brute force. His attempt to resist only increased the pressure on his own joints, turning his strength into liability. The police were almost on them now. An officer reached out, ready to assist, but held back for a fraction of a second, allowing the movement to complete. Protocol demanded clarity. They needed to see that control had truly changed hands. It had. He dropped to one knee, his posture broken, his balance irretrievable. Panic finally surged through him, sharp and blinding. He tried to pull away, to twist free, but his body no longer obeyed him the way it had minutes earlier. Fatigue and shock combined to slow his reactions, to make every movement sloppy and ineffective. She maintained pressure without excess. Her focus did not waver. She did not celebrate the shift or rush the outcome. She held him where he was weakest, using position and timing to keep him there. The discipline that had kept her still for so long now kept her precise. The police closed in fully. Hands grabbed his free arm, then the other. Commands were issued, firm and controlled, cutting through the haze. He resisted briefly, more out of instinct than strategy, but the resistance collapsed quickly. Without the knife, without leverage, without the illusion of control, he was just a tired man surrounded by trained professionals. They secured him to the pavement. The street exhaled. The tension that had held everyone rigid for so long released in a wave. People spoke at once, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. Phones continued to record, but the frantic energy had changed. What had been fear and anticipation turned into stunned observation. She stepped back, not dramatically, not with raised arms or triumphant gestures. She simply created space, putting distance between herself and the man who had held her moments before. Her breathing remained steady, her posture composed. She looked at the officers briefly, enough to signal that she was clear, that she did not need assistance. They noticed. One officer nodded, his attention already shifting to securing the scene. Another moved to retrieve the knife, carefully lifting it from the pavement and placing it into evidence. The object that had commanded the entire street minutes earlier now lay inert, stripped of its power. He lay face down, restrained, staring at the pavement. The realization crept in slowly, unwelcome and unavoidable. The plan had not failed because of bad luck or police interference. It had failed because he had been wrong. Wrong about fear, wrong about control, wrong about the woman he had chosen as his shield. He had bet everything on the assumption that fear would paralyze her. Instead, it had sharpened her. The crowd continued to murmur, some people replaying footage on their screens, others lowering their phones at last. The spectacle had ended, replaced by the quieter reality of consequence. Sirens faded into the distance as the immediate danger passed. She stood apart from it all, the noise washing around her without pulling her in. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered. Adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind clarity rather than chaos. She felt the ground beneath her feet again, the sun on her skin, the ordinary presence of the city returning piece by piece. Control had changed hands not through force, but through patience. And in that final, irreversible shift, the illusion that had sustained him dissolved completely, leaving nothing behind but the simple truth that fear, when misunderstood, was never the advantage he believed it to be. The street did not return to normal all at once. At first, it remained frozen in the shape the crisis had carved into it, as if the city itself needed time to accept that the danger had passed. Police officers moved with careful precision, their actions measured and procedural, restoring order step by step rather than rushing to erase what had happened. Hands guided the restrained man fully onto his stomach, checking his balance, securing his arms, removing the last traces of resistance with calm efficiency. The metal cuffs clicked shut, a sound quiet enough to be almost lost beneath the murmur of the crowd, yet final in its meaning. He lay there breathing hard, his face pressed to the pavement, staring at a crack in the asphalt that ran like a thin, meaningless fault line beneath his cheek. The world no longer revolved around him. The cameras that had once fed his sense of power now captured his stillness, his defeat rendered ordinary by procedure. Officers spoke above him, not to him, their attention already shifting from threat to process. He was no longer the center of the scene. He was an object to be handled, documented, removed. For a moment he tried to understand what had gone wrong. The answer did not arrive in a single revelation. It surfaced slowly, unwelcome and fragmented, as his racing thoughts struggled to keep pace with reality. He had done everything he believed was necessary. He had chosen carefully. He had waited. He had held tight. He had relied on fear to do the work he could not. Yet fear had betrayed him, not by vanishing, but by changing sides. The officers worked around him with practiced indifference, their focus fixed on safety and protocol rather than judgment. One checked his pockets. Another confirmed the absence of additional weapons. A third kept watch on the crowd, ensuring no one stepped too close. Their calm was not cruelty, it was professionalism. The situation, dramatic moments earlier, was now routine. A short distance away, she stood alone. No one rushed toward her at first. The police noticed her, of course, noted her position, her posture, the absence of visible injury. But there was no urgency in their approach. She did not look like someone in shock. She did not sway or clutch herself or search the faces around her for reassurance. She stood with quiet composure, her breathing controlled, her hands relaxed at her sides. The absence of drama was striking. Adrenaline ebbed gradually, leaving clarity in its wake rather than collapse. She became aware of small sensations returning to the foreground, the warmth of the sun on her shoulders, the rough texture of the pavement beneath her shoes, the distant sound of traffic resuming beyond the police perimeter. The city was reasserting itself, reclaiming the space that had been suspended for so long. An officer approached her then, stopping at a respectful distance. He spoke to her briefly, his tone neutral, his posture open. She answered simply, offering what was necessary without embellishment. There was no need to explain herself. What had happened was visible, recorded, undeniable. The evidence lay not only in words, but in the positions of bodies and the sequence of actions that had unfolded in plain view. The knife was already sealed in an evidence bag. It rested inside the clear plastic like an artifact from another moment, stripped of menace by transparency and context. Minutes earlier, it had commanded the attention of an entire street. Now it was just an object, tagged and cataloged, its threat neutralized by distance and procedure. The transformation felt almost symbolic. The crowd reacted in stages. At first, there was a low hum of voices, disbelief mixing with excitement as people processed what they had witnessed. Some replayed footage on their phones, pointing at screens, trying to reconcile the sudden shift from standoff to resolution. Others lowered their devices at last, the story already complete in their minds. The urgency that had driven them to watch faded into reflection. Gradually, the crowd thinned. People drifted away in small groups, conversations trailing behind them like echoes. The spectacle had ended. What remained was curiosity, then memory. The police continued to direct foot traffic, reopening lanes, restoring movement. The city resumed its rhythm, imperfect but persistent. He was lifted to his feet and guided toward a patrol car. The motion was firm but controlled, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He did not resist. The fight had left him, drained along with the adrenaline that had sustained it. As he walked, he felt the weight of eyes on him, not with fear now, but with assessment. He was no longer the man who held power through threat. He was a cautionary image, a figure defined by miscalculation. As the car door closed behind him, the sound felt definitive. Inside the vehicle, he stared straight ahead, his reflection faint in the glass. The realization settled deeper now, heavy and unavoidable. His mistake had not been tactical alone. It had been conceptual. He had believed that fear was universal, that it reduced everyone to the same fragile state. He had not understood that fear could be trained, managed, even used as a tool rather than a weakness. He had chosen someone who did not run from fear. He had chosen someone who understood it. Outside, the officers finished their work. Statements were taken. Details were recorded. The perimeter was dismantled piece by piece. The patrol cars remained for a while longer, lights still flashing, but the urgency had gone. What had been a crisis was now an incident, contained and filed away. She remained until she was no longer needed. There was no desire to linger, no impulse to seek attention or validation. The moment had not been a victory in the way stories often frame such things. It had been a necessary action, nothing more. She felt no urge to explain herself to the crowd or to claim ownership of what had happened. The outcome spoke for itself. When she finally turned to leave, she did so without ceremony. She stepped away from the cleared space and into the flow of the city, merging once again with the anonymous movement of people who had not known her before and would not recognize her after. The athletic clothes that had drawn his attention earlier now marked her as just another passerby, indistinguishable in the crowd. The street behind her bore little evidence of what had occurred. The police vehicles began to depart. The pavement remained cracked and sunlit. Shops reopened their doors. Conversations resumed. Within minutes, only the faint memory of tension lingered, like a shadow retreating with the light. What endured was not spectacle, but lesson. Fear, she knew, was neither enemy nor ally by default. It was a force that revealed character rather than creating it. In the wrong hands, it fueled panic and waste. In disciplined hands, it sharpened awareness and guided restraint. The difference lay not in the emotion itself, but in how one was taught to carry it. He had bet on fear as a weapon. She had treated it as information. As she walked on, leaving the scene behind her completely, the city closed the chapter without ceremony. The story would live on in recordings, in retellings, in the quiet recalculations of those who had witnessed it. But for her, the moment had already passed into something simpler. Experience, absorbed and set aside. The street continued forward, indifferent and intact, bearing no mark of the illusion that had briefly held it still, and no trace of the certainty that had undone the man who believed fear alone could give him control. If this story kept you watching, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. More real-life inspired stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Share this video with someone who loves intense, true-to-life stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.